Join us as we dive into the history, hauntings, and high strange of the world to try to better understand the paranormal. I will be your guide. I am paranormal researcher and investigator Eric Freeman Sims. Welcome to the Unseen Paranormal Podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Unseen Paranormal. Today we are chatting with investigator, researcher, folklorist, and author Heather Moser. You may know Heather from her work as a writer, producer, and crew member of Small Town Monsters. She is a classics professor and contributor to the Weird Writers blog for Into the Fray radio podcast. Today we're going to chat about how she got into researching folklore, cryptids, and high strangeness, and her role with the Small Town Monsters crew. You can find out more about Heather in the links in the show notes. Hey Heather, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I have laryngitis, so the audience knows, and we had to reschedule because the other day I couldn't talk at all. So
yeah,
I sound a bit rough, just for the audience. It is what it is. We'll just get through. I feel fine. So
good.
But thanks for coming on and joining us. I've been a huge fan of the Small Town Monsters documentaries for a while now, and I think they're probably the best paranormal documentaries out there. So,
wow.
How did you get involved with the paranormal to begin with, to want to do Small Town Monsters and all the folklorists and stuff that you do?
Yeah, so I've always been interested in the paranormal since I was a little girl, raised on unsolved mysteries, for one, Goosebumps books, scary stories to tell in the dark, things like that. And then I went to college and started researching. I was a classicist, so Greek and Roman history, and part of my favorite aspects of that were the myths and legends left from there, especially if they had any type of ghost story attached to them, and just really got deep into researching in general. But then after I graduated, I was really missing the researching aspect of things, like really a deep dive into stuff. And Small Town Monsters had already come across my radar because Seth had already put out a film called Minerva Monster, and that's actually not far from where I grew up. So I was already aware and had been following his work. And it was around Mothman of Point Pleasant, I saw that he had added more folklore to things, and that's something that always caught my interest anyway. So I started talking with him, and I continued my own research of weird stuff on my own. And I had been looking into cursed objects, and that led me to the Bell Witch Cave and the rocks at the Bell Witch Cave, of course. So after talking with Seth for a while, and then he announced that they were going to be doing a movie on the Bell Witch, I said, well, hey, I've already been looking into that if you want any help. And that was kind of the beginning of that. He said, yeah, let's do Bell Witch, but first help me with Momo and Mothman Legacy. And so I got to help with those two first, and then it's just gone from there.
No, that's awesome. Yeah, and the Bell Witch is not very far from me. I'm pretty familiar with the Bell Witch. Growing up in Middle Tennessee, people are always fascinated by the Bell Witch. And you're talking about the rocks. I've talked about that quite a bit because I find it fascinating that people take rocks from there and then they feel like they're cursed or whatever and send them back.
Yeah, absolutely. I was doing research into cursed objects, but specifically ones that do get sent back to wherever they were taken from, and people write letters explaining the horrible things that had happened to them. And all the letters seem to keep a similar format. You know, just it's a letter of apology and regret, really.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry I didn't listen to the legend, and now my life's falling apart. Please take this back. And that's what drew me to the Bell Witch story to begin with, was the cursed object aspect of things, and then it just went from there.
I think that's really cool that Seth and with the films started going toward the folklore, because I talk a lot here on my show and have from the beginning about the folklore behind whether it be ghost stories or things like the Bell Witch Cave or, you know, the cryptids. I think it's really important to keep that folklore alive, for one, because it's a history of storytelling in Appalachia, but also to understand where these cryptids and hauntings and things come from. And so maybe if you understand where they come from, you can understand a little more why they're happening.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with that. And I always enjoyed looking into similarities throughout time and location, it gives us a better idea of who we are or who different groups of people are, and all of our similarities throughout time, because really we're not that different. Even from ancient times, a lot of the same themes are still going on, just under a different name.
Yeah. And then also all around the world, you have some of these phenomena who have crossed the span of time and cultures who have never interacted with each other, but still have the same beliefs and things like that.
Yeah, that's the stuff that really fascinates me.
Yeah, because we're always, I mean, especially in the paranormal, world, we're always looking for connections to try to explain things. And so, yeah, I think that's why the folklore is and I find folklore fascinating. Coming from, Middle Tennessee, being not far from Appalachia,
Mm-hmm.
that's a huge tradition in the Appalachian Mountains. And we get a lot of our words, our vernacular from that, like the boogeyman came
Mm-hmm.
from the booger, the wood booger,
Yep.
which is just
Yeah.
another term for Bigfoot. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. So when because you grew up around that area, one story that I had heard from a few people was that kids that grew up in that area, instead of like saying Bloody Mary in the mirror, they were told that they couldn't say "I don't believe in you, Bell Witch." Is
Yeah.
that something you grew up with too?
Yeah. 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 The Belt Witch definitely was a bigger deal than people outside of Middle Tennessee.
Mm-hmm.
With even that, with changing the Bloody Mary thing to the Bell Witch in the mirror. Yeah, it's interesting how those take on regional meanings too. And
Mm-hmm.
I find it fascinating, especially with the cryptids. You have all these small towns that
Yeah.
there might have been only one cryptid sighting, but they still 50 years later, 100 years later, having festivals off this one sighting of this cryptid.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are places that people are like revitalizing stories. So right now in the cryptid community, one of the cryptids that kind of came back last year to like popular discussion was the squonk. He's out of Pennsylvania, and just it was like one or two people in the cryptid community read about him and really fell in love with his story, and then started making little stuffies and writing books. And all of a sudden now, this fall, there's going to be a Squonkapalooza. And I'm sure it will be an annual thing after that. But it was a renewal of a cryptid that nobody really talked about prior to like last year. And it's a story from the early 1900s, I believe. But yeah, so we even see that. And now they've got I don't know how long it's been going on, but I'm seeing people talk about it more, like the Jersey Devil Festival. There's been a huge resurgence in the Pope Lick monster,
Yeah.
just being a factor in festivals down around Louisville. Yeah, it's exciting to see. Like, I feel like now's the time for, if the community hasn't embraced it, now's the time to do it,
Yeah.
because everybody's interested. It seems like there's a huge resurgence of interest.
Yeah, and I think, like, for example, the Hopkinsville Goblin, I think
Yeah.
has seen a resurgence because of Hellier.
Yes. Absolutely. And they used to have a festival. I don't know if they've had one the last few years, but I do remember seeing that they had a festival for a little while. But I think COVID also shut a lot of stuff down.
Right.
And of course, the big one's Mothman Festival.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
now you're having like the Chicago Mothman, and like Mothman's being seen elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's just because people are seeing something similar, or because the Mothman hasn't been seen? I mean, it was only seen for a few days around Point Pleasant until the bridge collapsed, and then it's kind of been dormant, if it does exist, for 50 years.
Yeah, so it seemed like there was a cluster of sightings in like the 13 months or so preceding the bridge collapse. But then that's kind of where they quit talking about it afterwards. The bridge collapse. I mean, there was something else for the community to focus on. A horrible tragedy had occurred. But part of what we did for Mothman Legacy was I went to books and online forums and so on, and I found people who have had sightings of a Mothman-like creature since then. So the sightings are still occurring. It just doesn't seem to be as concentrated as it once was.
Yeah.
And then, of course, in Chicago, the idea is that they're seeing this like flying humanoid, And I think that part of that just becomes I don't know, like thinking of other cryptids, which one sounds closest.
Right.
They weren't seeing Bigfoot flying or whatever, like,
Yeah.
so I think Mothman kind of got brought into the fold. But initially, the sightings were just flying humanoid. Of course, Mothman, his initial sightings were more like a Birdman, too. So things morph and change over time.
Yeah. One of the things I found interesting, and I've never been a cryptid person. I've always been a paranormal investigator with ghosts, are kind of my forte. And kind of like you, I got my start long before the TV shows were on and things like that when I was a teenager, being interested in ghosts and things. But one of the things, and I may be wrong on this, that I've seen, especially in the past 3 or 4 years, is different folklore popping up that we've never heard about before, but apparently has been around. And probably the main example that I think of is like werewolves and dogmen. And it seems like whenever the Beast of Bray Road stuff came out, now everybody is searching for dogmen, and dogmen sightings are everywhere. And I find that fascinating. People, I guess my question is the chicken or the egg. Like, were people actually seeing dogmen, or is it because of the Beast of Bray Road stuff and people are now brave enough to come out and tell their stories? Which came first?
Right. Yeah, I think that we've seen it happen over the years with a lot of cryptids where there'll be a sighting and then there's just a whole cluster of sightings in the area because people come forward, or they've heard the story and they see something unusual, and so that's already in their head and they kind of attribute whatever oddness had occurred to that particular cryptid or sighting. The term dogman is relatively new when it comes to the cryptid community. We usually just said like werewolves.
Right.
And dogman came up, later, like you said, Beast of Bray Road and post that. And now it is everywhere. It seems like that's, aside from Bigfoot, when it comes to cryptids, I'd say the next most popular cryptid has to be dogman. And it is wild to see how deep some of this goes. I don't know, because there are people that argue that there is no such thing as dogman, that really what people are seeing are a Bigfoot with like an elongated snout of some sort. And I met a researcher out in New Mexico who steadfastly believes that there's no such thing as dogman, that what we're seeing are remnants of an ancient ape that has more of a baboon type face.
Yeah.
But because for us, something with an elongated snout like that was more reminiscent of a dog or a werewolf or something like that, we attribute it to dogman. But I don't know, when these sightings pop up and then people start digging into the folklore, it's not as if these creatures don't exist in the folklore related to the areas, whether it's the natives that lived in the area beforehand or immigrants that had come into the area. Everybody has stories of these creatures. So if you see something odd and you dig deep enough, you're probably going to find something in the lore that can correspond with what you saw. But as far as the rise in sight, I mean, at this point, I would think there's something to be said by the fact that dogman is so popular. So if you're out and you see some creature with pointed ears and a snout, that's already in your head, so that's the name you're going to give it, whether that's what it is or not.
Right.
But I honestly don't know. I don't know if there's like an uptick in sightings or anything like that. There seemed to be an uptick in sightings both in the cryptid world and also the paranormal world, it seemed, when COVID had shut everything down and people were forced to like stop their daily hustle and bustle. And I think we're more aware of their surroundings in general, whether they were just out doing nothing during leisure time out in the woods or whatever,
right,
or just being more aware of things in their house. And that, I had wondered if that was not so much a sign that activity was an increasing thing, just so much as we were more aware because the rest of the world had kind of stopped for a few months. And so we were more open to those experiences. I don't know.
Yeah, it just intrigued me because, werewolf folklore goes way back in history, especially in Europe and things like that. So, yeah, and one of the stories that I found was interesting because, like I said, growing up in Middle Tennessee, land between the lakes, I've gone up there my entire life. And until last summer, I went to a cryptid conference in Paris, Tennessee, and it was a dogman cryptid conference.
Yeah, so you heard Martin speak.
Yeah. And I never knew that land between the lakes was a huge like dogman hotspot for sightings. And then there's like this famous story in the 80s where apparently a dogman supposedly killed some campers.
Yeah, like a family.
Yeah. And I was just surprised because, I've dove into this stuff for years, especially, you know, in Tennessee, and never had heard that. So I found it interesting with the dogman stuff just popping up. There's some other weird phenomena that's popped up too in the past few years that I don't know if you know anything about, but one of them is the flannel man, or like the lumberjack guy.
Oh, yeah. Yes, I've heard of that. Like a Hat Man type figure.
Yeah, but the flannel shirt guy or the lumberjack is supposedly helpful to people.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just,
Yeah.
I don't know. And you hear people say there's a thinning of the veil or whatever. So I find it interesting that all these different things, you know, like that have popped up and people are seeing and reporting weird new cryptids and new phenomena.
Yeah. That reminds me of another thing that I've seen. It's become really popular on like TikTok over the last year. The concept of this not deer creature.
Yeah.
That was something that I'd never heard of at all until TikTok started talking about it. And like, I'm in the foothills of Appalachia. We never talked about a not deer. I mean, we talked about Bigfoot and things like that, but that's just new. And I'm not saying that maybe it didn't exist somewhere else, but part of me wonders if it wasn't just something that was made up relatively recently because it made a good story, or someone maybe saw a deformed deer or something like that, and now it's just kind of taken off. Like the idea of, and I hate even discussing this entity, but like Slender Man, didn't exist. Like it just didn't exist when I was little.
Right.
That wasn't a thing. Nobody talked about it, and then it comes about in these online forums, and the next thing you know, several years later, girls are trying to kill each other. You know, like sacrifice the one girl in the woods to Slender Man.
Right.
And people see him everywhere. So I wonder if sometimes these stories don't pop up, and then because it's already being discussed in our consciousness, that we kind of almost like a tulpa type situation,
right,
where we kind of think it into existence, because there's enough of an effort on everybody's part to think of it, and then all of a sudden there it is.
Yeah, and I've thought about that too, about the tulpa thing, and then some of the stuff I've also thought about maybe time slips with some of the werewolf dogman stuff, and even Bigfoot. Because when you get a Bigfoot, you have the two camps. You have one that believes in the flesh and blood creature, and you have the other that is into the woo, as they call it. And, you know, Bigfoot just all of a sudden disappears. Well, what if it was a time slip from an ape-like creature that lived, which we know in our past, you know, you have different ape-like humanoids that lived. Yeah. And somebody said, well, why would you think that? I said, well, when you see a bear in the woods, you don't go up and poke it to make sure it's real, do you?
That's true.
You know, you're like, shit, it's a bear. Let me get out of here, you know? And maybe we're seeing deer and bear and things like that are time slips. But like I said, you don't go up to poke it, make sure it's real.
Right.
And so maybe there is still some flesh and blood Bigfoot around. But, you know, some of the stuff that they consider woo, that's just a time slip that we're seeing.
Yeah. And like you said, there are two very distinct camps. And I've known just from doing some of the research for Small Town Monsters, it gets so viciously divided that you almost, I mean, you have to be careful when even trying to set up interviews, because some people will be so violently opposed to the woo, or violently opposed to the flesh and blood or whatever. And at that point, you kind of, I don't know, it's difficult. But everybody starts fighting amongst themselves. And I mean, to be honest, nobody knows. We don't have any definitive answers, so I'm not sure why we get so angry about it. But I think that the idea of like a time slip is not out of the question. I don't think the idea of possible portal things is out of the question.
Right.
It's one of those things that, and this was something that I came across in the paranormal too. Like I always believed in the paranormal and wanted it to be real, right? But then when you have your first experience, it still shakes you, because now there's this confirmation, okay, there are things that are different than I have been perceiving my entire life. So I guess I've gone the way of, if that's possible, then what else is possible?
Right.
Because half of that doesn't make any sense. So why in the world would I completely throw out other ideas? I don't know. That's the kind of thinking that I have when it comes to this thing. But I do know that people are very steadfast in their beliefs when they think they know or have spent years studying things. And they come up with a hypothesis. They don't want to hear any other ways, or they've already entertained them and they've come up with their own conclusions. So
yeah, I always look into people like things in boxes, and so if they can put it in a box to where they just enough for them to understand it, and they kind of don't want to go outside of that and
Mm-hmm.
admit, okay, maybe, I was wrong. Maybe I should change my views or whatever.
Yeah.
For me, I think the older I've gotten, I think it was like that very much with paranormal investigating with ghosts. When I was
Mm-hmm.
younger. Like my goal was to, okay, I'm going to capture evidence and wow the world with it. And
Right.
now that I've gotten older, investigating is completely different to me. I don't give a shit about capturing evidence for other people. It's all about proving it to myself at this point,
Mm-hmm.
over and over again, like, and getting this, the evidence for me and having personal experiences and that connection with the past instead of, and I do capture evidence. Don't get me wrong, I get AVPs and I've got some cool pictures and things like that I can explain. But yeah, it's less about trying to set the world on fire. But also my views, especially doing the show and talking to different people, listening to what they have to say, my views have definitely changed over the past 3 or 4 years. Just from listening to other people's opinions and saying, okay, well, not that I am flip-floppy on my views, but I was wrong on this. This makes more sense to me.
Yeah, I think it's important to have that. And then also the acknowledgement that, we haven't experienced everything.
Right.
There's no way that we're ever going to experience everything that there is to feel and know and see. So if other people are having these stories, who am I to tell them, no, that's not what happened? Because even on some level, if it was something they completely imagined, then it was still real to them at the time.
Right.
So I don't have any place to tell them that they're wrong.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I come from now. Like I said, when I was younger, I would be trying to tell somebody, well, that couldn't have happened because of this, and this, or I'd be trying to debunk their story. It was just an old creaky house or whatever. Well, yeah, now I realize, well, I can't say that. I wasn't there. I don't want people discrediting my personal experiences. So who am I to discredit theirs?
Yeah, exactly. And we tend to do that so often that sometimes it's difficult to get people to share their stories because that's the first reaction they've gotten from people when they do go to share it. And so they just shut down after that. Nobody's going to believe me, or even worse, they get mocked or something.
Right.
And so they just clam up and don't say anything.
Yeah, and I've had so many people when I do conventions or any kind of thing in person where I'm talking to, different people, they'll come up to me and be like, I don't believe in ghosts or I don't believe in Bigfoot, but here's my story.
Yeah.
Because I think they want to gauge if you're going to think they're crazy or not.
Right.
And, I try to always do it with an open mind and say, no, I've had crazy experiences I can't explain. I can tell you some crazy shit that you'd be like, what? You're crazy, And so, try not to discount anybody. I think that's important, like you're saying, because people are afraid to come out and tell their stories. And I think luckily with like the internet, that's one of the good things on the internet with, Reddit and creepypastas and things like that people actually have an outlet for that without putting themselves out there. They can hide behind a screen and still tell their stories.
Right. Yeah. And they can find a community, and that's important.
Right. And I think that's also what's important about Small Town Monsters and what y'all do with all the different topics that you've done with cryptids and UFOs and things. I think it helps people. Okay, here's a serious documentary, not making fun of anybody, but also doesn't have an agenda that puts the research out there, the folklore, the people's stories without making fun of anybody. And here you make up your own mind.
Right. Yeah. And that's something that I've been really proud of that Small Town Monsters has been able to accomplish, and something that's actually made my job easier when it comes to getting witnesses willing to speak with us on the different topics is that we have a body of work that's easily accessible because, well, we have a lot of stuff on YouTube now, so that's the easiest thing to send people to. But I can go up to a witness or an experiencer and ask them if they're willing to share their story, and they're still hesitant, understandably so. But then I can link them to the things that we've created and say, listen, I know you don't know me, and I could be feeding you a line for all you know. I get it.
Right.
How about you just look at what we've done, though, and that will let you know how we approach things. And that's been helpful multiple times, especially with UFO experiencers. Those have been ones that have been more difficult to get to come forward. So it's been helpful to just give them the link and say, go check out some of our stuff and then talk to me afterwards. I won't try to convince you of anything.
Right. Yeah, and like I said, I think that helps people feel more comfortable coming out with their stories, and I think we need everybody to tell their stories because it adds to the bank of evidence of these things are really happening. And then when you put multiple stories together of the same kind of entity or cryptid or paranormal experience, that speaks to, it almost gets into a scientific method of, okay, it's not repeatable in the scientific method, but when you have 1,000 people who aren't connected in any way, shape, or form, have nothing to gain off of telling this, but they've had the same experience, there's got to be something to this.
Right. Yeah. And I think that that's important for that. And also for people that are completely against any of these stories, it's still important to have them recorded because say you have no belief in the paranormal or cryptids or anything like that, the fact that these stories exist and in such a volume amongst people that are not connected, just studying that alone will allow you to kind of look into sociological aspects or anthropological aspects of humans. And like you can see the trends throughout history, and that alone allows you to study humans,
right?
And like what is fascinating to our minds, even if you were to throw out all belief in it, I think that there's still value to it.
Yeah. So over all of your research and the folklore and all these cryptids and things, what are some of your favorite cryptids and favorite folklore about cryptids and the high strangeness?
So some of my favorites. Well, I'm fascinated but terrified of the Wendigo. I'm like morbidly curious, I guess, is probably a good way to put it when it comes to the Wendigo. And we haven't had a chance to really dive into that in STM, so I haven't gone completely into that yet. But what I have taken time to do on my own has been interesting and disturbing. The Goat Man keeps popping up everywhere, and he's interesting. I find him one of the more interesting cryptids because a lot of his stories kind of overlap with urban legend.
Yeah.
And that adds another layer of complexity and intrigue for me that you don't necessarily see with something like Bigfoot or Dogman. So those ones are my, I guess, favorite, but I would never want to see either of them. I definitely
Right.
never want to see a Dogman. And Bigfoot, in all reality, I believe that Bigfoot exists, but even if I were to see one, it's still going to mess with me.
Right.
Even though I think that I've had experiences with them before, physically seeing that in front of me is still going to mess with me. But I don't think that it would ruin me quite as much as something like a Dogman or a Goatman. That, I don't know, that kind of stuff, it really freaks me out.
Yeah.
And with ghost stories, I mean, it's hard not to. For me, I adore the story of the Bell Witch. I find Kate hilarious with some of the stuff that she did. Obviously, she was really nasty, but the way that she would just tease and taunt,
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like she had quite a sense of humor, even if it was pretty vicious. So that would be more of one of my favorite paranormal stories.
Yeah, the Bell Witch it's fascinating to me. I've talked about it here on the show. I've had Pat Fitzhugh on before and kind of dove deep into it.
Yeah.
It definitely fascinates a lot of people. Adams, they still have the festival every year where they do the play, and finally the cave is back open for tours and things, and now they've actually embraced the paranormal of the cave, and they're actually doing paranormal events there now. So
that's good.
Yeah. But yeah, as far as like the Dogman, I don't know if I've ever heard or seen a good story like where it was it's the stories are always horrifically, it's chasing somebody's car or trying to kill somebody, or there's no good side to it. To where Bigfoot, you hear good stories, as well as like crazy Bigfoot try to kill me stories.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Like you said, you don't hear really good things about Dogman. The closest thing to good that I've ever heard was probably when we were making Skinwalker Howl of the Rougarou. One of the witnesses there, what her experience was, it wasn't trying to kill her, but she would have been a young girl and she messed with some native artifacts that had been like plowed up in the garden. Her grandfather told her, don't mess with that, just leave it where it is, and she didn't listen. She took it back, and then every night this thing that she said looked, the only way she could describe it, or the best way she could describe it, is that it looked like the Egyptian god Anubis, would show up in her room and stand next to the bed and basically tell her, not like more like through mind speak, I believe, than verbally talking, but let her know, you need to put that back. You need to put it back. Now, he never did anything to her physically, and once she put it back, then he was gone. So in that aspect, he was more of like a guardian, but he didn't get violent.
Yeah.
But that's rare when people come forward with stories about Dogman, is to have one that just shows up as like a guardian type thing. Most of them are horribly nasty. And there's this, everybody says you get this overwhelming sense of evil and dread upon seeing it. So there's something instinctually within us that lets us know this is not a good thing, nothing to be messed with.
Yeah, and people say that about whenever there's like a mountain lion stalking you and things too. People have been in those situations or been attacked by them. They've said that, and whether they ever see it or not, they say, if you're being stalked by a predator like that, your body just knows. So I find that interesting too with the dogmen, how our bodies would have that same reaction, even though dogmen may or may not exist as far as flesh and blood. It may be like interdimensional or something, but just to have that visceral reaction of like, all of a sudden we're prey and we're used to being the predators.
Right. Yeah. It's something that we're completely, we're not used to very often at all.
And another thing that fascinates me, you had mentioned urban legends, and that's one thing I find fascinating. You have so many urban legends around, we'll just say the United States, that people will, different cities will claim to be their own, but they're kind of all across the United States. One of the biggest ones that comes to mind to me always is the bus full of children that got hit on the train tracks, and they'll push you over the train tracks. Now, if you stop, and you'll have handprints on the back of your car.
Yeah. Yeah. It does seem like what's interesting when you look at when you find them in larger scales across the U.S., there's always something slightly different, it seems, that makes it unique to that region. Whatever. I mean, I do know that story because I feel like there's one in Texas that's coming to mind.
Yeah, San Antonio.
Like the car neutral.
Yeah.
And they push you across the tracks. But you've got like the vanishing hitchhiker, the dead boyfriend. There's the babysitter that gets murdered. But what's really a neat thing about that is, regardless of what the story is or the details of it, people are certain that, oh, well, yeah, a cousin of my friend, his mother had this happen.
Yeah.
Or, like you're certain that it did happen. It was somebody not in your immediate circle, but close enough that you feel somewhat confident that this actually happened. But there's been so much work into looking into urban legends and some of their variations, that one of the things that I also find interesting when it comes to like the vanishing hitchhiker is that you'll see tropes that you can figure out like where people are from or where their family is from based on the version of the urban legend that they heard.
Right.
So there was one that they were talking about people around Chicago, the vanishing hitchhiker. There's a variation of the vanishing hitchhiker that whenever it's told, you can pretty much assume that family or that person's family was from the Chicago area, because there's something about it that is reminiscent of when the World's Fair happened. And I can't remember the exact detail, but there's just some subtle differences that let you know, okay, this person's from the Midwest, or their family was from the Midwest or whatever. Or if they're not from there and that's the first time they heard it, that's where they heard it, was from that region.
Yeah. Is it Resurrection Mary? That's Chicago?
Maybe.
I think it is. I think she's a hitchhiker outside of a cemetery that disappears, and her grave is in the cemetery.
Right. Yeah, that's one that's common too. And some of them, the story is that like the seat is wet when they disappear because it had been raining or whatever. They were in wet clothes, and so the car seat's left wet after they disappear. Yeah. Oh, that's really cool. It also makes for really good stories if you ever want to write short stories, because since there is such variation in them, but the certain tropes that stay the same, it's really fun to make your own story if you were up for making like a short story fiction thing. Just throw that out there.
Right. Yeah, because you can base it off of that simple premise and go kind of wherever you want with it.
Yeah.
We have one close to here that's a variation on a few different types of legends. It's called the White Bluff Screamer. Now, all of these different legends have all become this huge mishmash, and it depends on who you talk to what the White Bluff Screamer is.
Right.
So
Yeah, that was something that when probably the deepest research that I did as far as tearing apart the folklore to like try to get to some of the original stories was whenever we did Rougarou. And I saw the same thing there where, and it's even reflected in the movie. Some people talk about the Rougarou as like this hitchhiker on the road, like you were talking about the woman in white, but on Bayou Sally Road, the idea is that if you see a hitchhiker, you do not stop, you do not let them in your car because that's the Rougarou. But also the idea is that the Rougarou could really be anything,
yeah,
not just a werewolf type creature, even though that's what we tend to think of now. But depending on how you turn into a Rougarou or how it manifests, when you start going back in history books and old folklore books, you see that all of this it's a mishmash now, but you can discern what pieces still make, like what pieces are evident today. You can pull it apart and see, okay, well, this is from the French, this is from the Homa tribe, this is a Creole thing. Like you can just start pulling it apart and see what aspects from the different legends kind of battled it out to make it through today
yeah,
to create what the Rougarou is now. But it's the same thing, depending on who you're talking to and the stories they heard, what their heritage was, will dictate what the Rougarou is.
yeah. It's pretty. It just the urban legends and things like that just fascinate me. And like we were talking about too, how some of them are so localized, but they have so much in common with lots of other stories from around the country, and everybody kind of claims it as theirs.
Yeah, and some of these stories, I'm trying to think, like the I think it was the Vanishing Hitchhiker one. That's the one that makes sense. There are stories, if you go back far enough, where it's not even an automobile. It's back with like horse and buggy, where people just on horses, and somebody shows up and they go by them, and this ghost or whatever hops on the back of the horse. All of a sudden, the horse is weighed down. So it even precedes, like the ones that have a modern flair to them,
Yeah,
to a certain extent, like an automobile, still existed prior to cars. Now, I'm not saying, obviously, things that would be an internet situation or whatever, maybe that existed in book form or something. But yeah, they're not new.
yeah. To me, like I said in the beginning, just all the whether any of the stories are true, I just love hearing them because it's that that Appalachian tradition of sitting around and telling stories, and we get so much of our culture from just that.
Yeah.
So in making all the different films that y'all have made for Small Time Monsters, have any of them changed your mind? UFOs or Bigfoot or any of those different stories? Has it changed your mind on any of those phenomena to say, oh, maybe this is real?
Well, I'm pretty open about any of them in general. I would say the idea of a dog man seemed absurd, a werewolf or whatever seemed ridiculous. At this point, it doesn't. And even though I thought it was ridiculous, it wasn't. I don't mean to say that I was discounting that people had experiences.
Right.
I just couldn't fathom how that would happen. And the same thing when we went to Chicago and did some of the Mothman stuff up there. I mean, Mothman is Point Pleasant in my mind. I'm not saying that it is other places as well, obviously, but just I never even considered whether Mothman was real or not. It was just part of Point Pleasant. But when I went up to Chicago, I'm like, okay, how does this work? This isn't Point Pleasant. But after talking with witnesses, they're seeing something, and I'm not doubting that. I don't know what it is. So that's kind of, I mean, if nothing else, it's opened me up more. Of the movies that we've done, the only thing that hasn't like been an eye-opening thing as far as people are really seeing something is when we did the Jersey Devil, and that's only because we didn't look for witnesses. We did that movie focused on the historical texts and scholars today. So there wasn't a chance for me to hear stories from people who may still be having a thing. I imagine it would be the same if we were to ever do something on the Dover Demon. It seemed to be something that happened once upon a time, even though it happened more than once, but it's older now, and nobody really talks about it anymore. But I have heard that people have had experiences with the Jersey Devil. I've just never spoken to them. But I'm always open for hearing stories, and I'm sure that it's still eye-opening to hear when people are willing to share their experiences. That's just one that, through work, I haven't had any firsthand encounters from anybody just because we didn't go that way with our film.
Yeah.
Another thing that I hadn't put too much thought into prior to working for Small Town Monsters was UFOs and aliens. I think a lot of that is just because the idea unnerves me so much that I just never wanted to think about it. But now we've done like 3 on the trail of UFOs, and I was involved in the last 2, so Dark Sky and Night Visitors. And stuff was happening. I mean, people have had experiences, and some of them are really messed up from it. Whatever that may be, it's an experience that I don't wish to have.
Yeah.
So that didn't really change my mind on on how excited I am about UFOs, but it certainly made me very clear that I don't want to encounter one.
Yeah. Yeah, that is pretty scary. Thing these beings can just come into your house and take you whenever they want. You can't do anything about it. Yeah,
right.
I understand. I'm with you on that. I'm good. It's the same reason I don't go out in the woods looking for Bigfoot or dogmen. I don't want to be one of the ones that have a bad experience,
Right, exactly.
At least with, I don't know, at least with investigating ghosts, I kind of, after 25 years of it, I kind of know what to expect, So, all the films with Small Town Monsters you're involved with, what else do you have going on? What do you have coming up?
Right now, I'm working on a variety of short stories that I've been submitting to various zines. Some of them I'm waiting to hear back from. They're fiction stories. So writing short stories. I'm currently researching headless ghosts, but in an effort to find names associated with the headless ghosts to put a story to who these people were prior to becoming the headless ghost that is seen in old newspaper articles or whatnot. And I'll be presenting about that at the Haunted America conference in Alton next week. But yeah, there's that. Also, I'm collecting stories from all over Appalachia with the goal that someday I'll have stories from all of it, even if they're just little pieces. But I want to have stories from like every county that's considered Appalachia by the ARC and find a way to put all that together. But yeah, that's kind of where I am right now.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. Yeah, I love that there are people out there like you collecting these stories to make sure they live on. Because unfortunately, some of the older people in Appalachia that tell a lot of stories in that area, when they're gone, the stories would be gone too.
Right. Exactly. Not only are their stories gone, one thing that has crossed my mind multiple times is the stories will be gone, but also their way of speaking will be gone.
Yeah.
Because with each generation, we lose parts of the accent or certain terms that if we don't record them before those people are gone, then they're just lost.
Yeah.
I mean, I've even talked myself out of certain words that I used when I was younger, just as I got older, because you'd get teased for sounding a certain way. So I kind of broke myself of it. But now it's in my mind that I once said things a certain way, but that's not who I am now. So that's lost in a sense. But if I record my parents, then not only do I have my parents' voices to listen to for the rest of my life, and my kids and grandkids and all of that will be able to hear them, but also that the way they speak will always be there for them to hear as well. And you can track the changes or just hear the little nuances and things.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. All right, Heather. Well, I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I hope your voice comes back soon.
Yeah. It's slowly getting there. Slowly. All right. Like I said, I will have all the links for Small Town Monsters and all the Heather stuff in the show notes. So make sure you go check her out. If you are not familiar with Small Town Monsters, you are losing out. Go check them out on all their videos are on Amazon Prime. A lot of them are on YouTube as well. All right, everybody. Y'all stay safe out there. We'll see you next time. Have a good day.
Thank you for listening to the Unseen Paranormal Podcast. Join us next week for an all-new amazing guest. And in the meantime, please go on Spotify or Apple and give us a rate and a review. And go over to YouTube and hit that subscribe button. Also, if you would like to submit your story, you can email it to unseenparanormalpodcast@gmail.com. And you can remain anonymous if you like. Once again, thank you for listening. We'll see you next time. Stay safe out there.